Welcome back. As we start off today, Africa is in our line of vision, not just, issues from the home front. And for good reason, because many decades after Walter Rodney's book, I'm sure many of you are quite familiar of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, which pretty much argues that slavery, the era of industrialization, pretty much set Africa back in terms of development, putting in place structural barriers. But many years after that, many African countries still remain, beneath the poverty line in terms of human development indexes. So it brings back the question of leadership on the African continent. And that's why we're asking this morning broadly, do Africans elect their leaders? And that's the question for the day. The email is going to be scrolling very soon on your screen. I would like you to respond to that question from your own experience, and not just from home now, from any part of the world that you're watching us from on the Morning Brief on Channels Television this morning. So let's introduce our panel of discussants. We have a very broad panel this morning from across Africa. From home, we have Mr. Samson Itodo. He's the Executive Director, Yaga Africa. He joins us via Zoom from Geneva. We'll also have on the program this morning, Mr. Jeff Mote. He's the head of content and production, the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute, who joins us virtually from Kenya. Of course, not forgetting Mr. Khalifa Said Rashid, editor-in-chief, the Chanzo Zoom, who joins us via Zoom from Tanzania. And we have Ms. Bonolo Makagali. I hope I got that name. There's a very unique consonant in the South African language. But Ms. Makagali also joins us. She's the program manager, by the way, Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, who joins us virtually as well from Pretoria, South Africa. Good morning, gentlemen and lady. Thank you immensely for joining us on the program.
A very good morning to you.
I'm going to start with Ms. Makagali this morning. Whenever the African leadership question surfaces, the leadership question broadly surfaces back home here in Nigeria, there's a consensus that, leadership is the challenge. But we'd like to understand it broadly from the African perspective, having an aerial view. When it comes to discussions on the leadership challenge in your country, or perhaps, when you listen to conversations from other parts of the continent, what seems to be the consensus of opinion on the challenge with development? All right. Yes, she can hear me. Go ahead.
It's Bonolo Makale. I know it's a bit of a complex name to pronounce, and thank you again for having me. I think I want to start here specifically in answering the question that you've asked about whether, Africans are electing leaders. And to be honest, I think that what we are witnessing, particularly through the mechanism of elections, we are witnessing a selection dressed up as elections, in a sense that, leaders continue to re-elect themselves through the process of electoral mechanisms. And particularly within the South African context, which is, you would understand, our history, where, more than decades ago, South Africa had experienced an unjust system of apartheid. And then 35 years ago, we then transitioned to a democratic South Africa. And, the transition to democratic South Africa, particularly for us, that we're able to witness apartheid, not just read about it in books. I mean, I was 11 years old in 1994 when South Africa transitioned to the new democratic government. There seemed to be hope that, some of the injustices that South Africa has experienced through apartheid, but also the fact that, the Black democratic government will respond to things like poverty in South Africa, will respond to things like access to education, access to adequate housing. And what we're seeing is completely different. And so this idea that, promises were made that democracy will then deliver basic needs of South Africans, as it looks like right now, is that the quality of democracy as it experienced by an ordinary South African looks very different from the form of democracy as we see it in South Africa. And so the leadership crisis that we have here, it's a concerning leadership crisis. It's a leadership crisis that does not have, that lacks accountability. It's also a leadership crisis that, in my opinion, quite frankly, uses states' resources to benefit itself and fails to prioritize citizens and fails to prioritize the will of the people. And again, it brings back to this idea of democracy then when we think about democracy and ways in which leaders are elected or are appointed, I think the question that we must then ask is this idea of procedural democracy and substantive democracy. Again, I'll make an example about South Africa. South Africa has been rated to arguably have the best form of democracy in Africa. Our Independent Electoral Commission, arguably does well. We have issues around, separation of power, the judiciary's independence. But the way in which democracy is experienced substantively looks absolutely different. And so that's why we see African citizens and South Africans in particular really struggling with the idea of democracy, conceptually, I must add. Not conceptually, but rather practically, I must add. And that's why we see also young people deciding, to choose not to go to the polls because they're thinking, are we really electing leaders, or all of this is dressed as elections, and leaders really reinstating themselves with no sense of accountability, no sense of transparency, but also no sense of wanting to respond to really fundamental needs of African citizens.
All right, Bonono, thank you very much. Let me come to Mr. Saeed Rashid. Ms. Makagale says, in South Africa, that had, arguably is one of the best democracies on the continent, the youths there still have reservations. Is it the case, across board, or there are exceptions to the rule in terms of the leadership question?
Thank you very much. So, first of all, speaking from Tanzania, it must be very disappointing to hear what we just had from our colleagues from South Africa. From where I sit, we look at South Africa as a model, as a very democratic country, a country that we aspire to as a country. But, really, I don't think that there are exceptions. I think this is a rule for almost all parts of Africa. And to be honest with you, I think this is not even an issue limited to Africa. So, for example, we have these famous, distinguished Egyptian activist, feminist, novelist, Nawal El-Saadawi, and whenever she attended an interview, for example, in any Western capital or being interviewed by any Western media, and this question was posed to her, do you think there is democracy in Africa? And she would quip like, is there democracy anywhere? So, for example, if she is being interviewed in London, she would say, is there democracy here in the UK? If she's being interviewed in Washington, she would pose the same question, because according to her, people all over the world do not really elect their leaders, and factors can vary. Factors that characterize what is happening in the US cannot be the same factors that characterize the situation here in Tanzania, for example, or in Uganda, or in Mozambique, or Zambia. But I think to respond to your question directly, I don't think that there are exceptions. There are, of course, some countries here in the continent that display unique features when it comes to democratic governance. As I said, South Africa, and the previous speaker rightly pointed it out, there could be issues within the South African political system or democratic system, but it provides some lessons that other countries in Africa would benefit immensely from learning. Or Botswana, for example, is another country that is being held. And actually close here in East Africa, for example, Kenya is far away from where we are here in Tanzania. But generally speaking, I think if you scratch the surface, going a little bit deeper from what is being seen outside, as our previous speaker pointed out, there remain structural, substantial issues that need to be worked on to ensure that eventually Africans and all people around the world really are able to actually elect their leaders. Well, I will give you an example of Tanzania for perspective's sake. At least to give my my South African colleague the reason to be at least happy about what is happening in South Africa. In Tanzania, it's pretty dark, I would say. So, for example, to begin with, it is the president that appoints the chair of the Electoral Commission. It is the president that appoints the Chief Justice of the Judiciary. It is the president who is also the head of the government. He is also the head of the state. He is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. She is also the chairperson of the ruling party. She also appoints the Inspector General of Police. She appoints TDF, Chief of Defense Forces. And she has all these powers invested in her that some here have concluded that she is sort of an imperial president. So we are a republic, but with the hallmark of monarchy.
Right.
Our president is, above the law. You cannot challenge the presidential victory in the court. You cannot petition the court to look at the presidential victory. So I think we are in a pretty bad shape in Tanzania. And we look up at South Africa, we look up at Kenya, we look up at Botswana, and we wish that one day we at least get to a point where they are right now.
From your conversation, lots of different threads to pull. We'll talk more about the Tanzania situation. Perhaps we'll have another panel that asks, does the world elect her leaders, really? Because you've talked about how democracy has its challenges across the world. I'm also going to be asking our panelists what they think of governance in Nigeria, but that's towards the tail end. Let me come to Mr. Jeff Mote and sort of ask him about the Kenyan situation. I think this year has seen too many protests led by Gen Zs in Kenya. A lot of them asking for the resignation of the president, almost trying to say, if we elect our leaders, we should be able to remove the leaders, right, when we want. So speak to the Kenyan situation, particularly because Tanzania looks up to Kenya.
Well, thank you so much, even for being on this particular panel. And I'd like to start from the point of view that in Africa right now, and this is something that you realize in every room that you go to, if you're above 35 years of age, you're the minority. Speaking honestly. And that's why you really need to look at this as leaders in political institutions, leading states, leading organizations. Your paradigm, your vision really needs to speak to this youth, because let's be honest, without the youth's buy-in in your organization, or if you're a president of your state, you really don't have that legitimacy to move forward with it. And that's something that really came to the fore with what was now called the Gen Z protests. And the thing is, we have a generation that knows what they want, isn't afraid to speak, isn't afraid to speak to power. And they did that, and they did that consistently. But above and beyond that, what we did realize was the fact that it wasn't really a presidential issue. And I think Said has also brought it out in the sense that when you have an executive that has all of these powers, what we do have also are, levers, checks and balances on how to make sure there are no excesses. And in our case, we have a presidency that will institute certain policies in place, will appoint certain people in place, we'll have an executive that will put certain bills in place as well. But you also have the legislature that's supposed to be the check and balance to this. And what really brought this to a head, especially what we saw with that particular protest, was the fact that we had an institution of the legislature, of parliament, that really wasn't playing that crucial representation role. Because you had the people speaking to the parliamentarians, telling them that, specifically with that case of the finance bill, because that's when the whole world was watching Nairobi, telling them that this is punitive for the creators, this is going to cripple our industry, for various business people, this will not be tenable, but they weren't listening. And every single time, the parliamentarians are reminded that their roles are three. You have oversight, you have representation as well, you have legislation. If you're not representing the people, that is where it all falls apart. And that really is what happened at that particular point in time. So still at this point, a lot of what they call in Nairobi political terms, the listening to the ground, going to the people, because we have elections in a year or so down the line. And because of that, they have realized how fragile this particular relationship between the politicians, the elected, and those electing is. And that really has been the key lesson moving forward at this particular point, that the voice of the people will be heard. I think in Latin, they say the voice of the people is the voice of God. And that really is what came to the fore. So for me, at this particular point, is the fact that when we have these institutions that are not playing their roles, it forces the public to step up and be that check and balance. And that's what really played out with Gen Z being almost what has been called now the fourth arm of government, because legislature wasn't playing their part. They didn't have faith in judiciary at that particular point in time. So they stepped up to fill that void. And when the institutions aren't strengthened enough, they have to take it into their own hands. And that's what played out in Nairobi.
So this conversation is basically looking at the African situation from south to east to west. So naturally, I'll come to Mr. Samson Itodo of Yaga Africa. And I know you go across Africa, no pun intended, because it's Yaga Africa, and you basically study the situation in the countries. Khalifa said that for Tanzania, they look up to South Africa, Kenya, Botswana. I was hoping Nigeria would be on that top three, but somehow it isn't, maybe by omission or what have you. What has been, from your own perspective, the Nigerian situation, electing leaders? I know you and I and the team, we've had these conversations time and again, but listening to the situation across other African countries, what jumps at you?
Well, thanks and good morning. Just listening to the three previous speakers, South Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania, there's one thing that is clear, that the entire world is grappling with a leadership crisis. And it's not just Africa. We must acknowledge the fact that across the world, there's an absence of leadership. All the countries that we all look up to have demonstrated that there is no system that is insulated from collapse, from capture. So we must acknowledge that across the world, the whole leadership crisis affects us all. When we bring it home to Africa, and I've listened to those three brilliant previous speakers, one thing is very, very clear, that the leadership crisis that we grapple with on the continent, manifest in several ways, whether they are systemic governance failures, or we see elite capture, as was mentioned in the three countries, including Nigeria. You also see authoritarian tendencies, whether it's Nigeria or it's Tanzania, including Kenya. There's also weak institutions. And when you look at what Claude Ake says about the state of Africa's leadership, most of the problems that have been highlighted can be traced to the leadership models that have produced colonial administrative logic that emphasizes centralization, commandism, political patronage, and transactional authority. So when you look across the continent, one of the biggest problems that we face is that our colonial experience, especially for most countries, imposed on us a leadership model that was extractive, that was designed for no other reason than control and resource exploitation. So when you look at post-colonial leaders, because of this framework that they adopted, what you just see is a leadership that has become more positional than relational, one that is cohesive and not rather than legitimate. And the sad tale is the fact that most of the leadership that we experience across the continent is self-serving rather than developmental. So that's the biggest problem that we face across board. So when you think about whether Africa elect their leaders, yes, we can say to a large extent, in some instances, yes, we do. But the bigger question is not just whether we elect our leaders, is what we get from our leaders. And Bonolo talks about output and input legitimacy and the whole discourse on democracy. That yes, on one hand, when you look about input legitimacy is derived from how participatory, the extent of participation, how people elect, how people participate in that decision making. But look across the continent. How many elections can we say reflect the outcome and the priorities and the will of the people? You look at West Africa, we're grappling with authoritarian tendencies and changes of government and military coups. We just experienced one, even though it failed, in Benin Republic. All of these are just manifestation of the fact that people feel, one, excluded, and political leadership have not delivered to the people. So my point is, yes, in some instances, there are cases where people have elected leaders. Senegal is a classic example, how popular choice determined the outcome. When you look at Ghana, when you look at Liberia, there are examples. Unfortunately, these are outliers, but our task is to see how we expand these pockets of political emancipation so that across the continent, when we look from the north to the east to the south and to west, we see democracy evolving with leaders that address the two fundamental problems that people face. One is welfare, in other words, their social economic conditions, and second, security.
Let's take you to Said Rashid. Building on what Mr. Itodo had said, and Mr. Itodo, let's build on what Mr. Itodo had said, piggyback from what Mr. Itodo had said, talking about not just about the leadership, he emphasized that strongly, but about the issues around social contract as far as the people are concerned, because social contract is basically we obey the laws so that you provide and protect for us as much as possible. So, Said, I was going through a few things, and the reason why this question is particularly important is because you go to some countries, and as we've all agreed, it's better in some countries than the others. You see some countries where there's terrible leadership, yet the people get re-elected over and over and over and over again. So it begs the question whether indeed it is the people that made those choices or something else is responsible. So my direct question to you is, how does a very young continent that is competing with global innovation seem to have this obsession with old people in governance who are not innovative, who are not forward-thinking, who are barely surviving at the end of the day? How do we match all of these discrepancies that we see in terms of the quality of leadership we have as against the young population they want to lead?
Okay, it's a pretty loaded question. I will try. So I think it has so much to do with our willingness, I think, as the people to allow that. I think many constitutions in African states, have these preambles where they say that all power belongs to the people, that authorities should be derived from the people. And that is true. It is true that because, first of all, we are many, they are few. Like, for example, a government can have how many people, even if it's 1 million people. In Tanzania, for example, we are 64 point something million people. So we are many, they are few. And while there could be other explanations to explain your question, I think it also has something to do with our acceptance of that status quo, to allow it to continue to exist. And we see that changing. We see that changing everywhere. People are rising up and say, no, this can no longer be the case. In Tanzania, I'm just going to stick to Tanzania. In Tanzania, for example, we have a political party that has been in power for over 6 decades. Since 1961, we have been ruled by one political party, which is Chama cha Mapinduzi, the party of revolution. And this party has been, quote unquote, winning elections since multi-party system was reintroduced in Tanzania in 1992, and we had our first multi-party election in 1995. Because at some time, those who were in power abolished multi-party democracy in Tanzania and introduced a single party system. So starting from 1995, we had another election in 2000, and this political party has been winning, quote unquote, throughout. How is it able to win in these elections? Is it through systematic exclusion of viable opposition, through the entrenching, because the party has entrenched itself in the state structures that in Tanzania, for example, it is no longer possible to distinguish between the party and the state. You cannot draw the line between the ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, and the Tanzanian state. So we have had that for over 6 decades. And it has reached a point where people say that, no, it is no longer going to be the case. And it is in this context that we saw what happened on October 29th, where Tanzania witnessed one of the most vast, big youth-led protests, which has never happened in Tanzania's history, or at least 30 years plus of its multi-party democracy. And how did it come about? It came about because in the lead up to election, the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi went extra miles to exclude the main opposition party, Chadema. It arrested its leader and potential challenger of President Samia Suluhu Hassan of the ruling party. So the state gave him a treason charge. He is still in detention. And they went extra mile to exclude another potential opposition candidate from another opposition party called the ACT Wazalendo. And there were calls that this is not sustainable. If you keep excluding viable opposition politicians, it's not going to be sustainable. And we saw what happened on October 29th, that youth rose up and said, no, enough is enough. We are not going to allow this thing to happen in perpetuity. And of course, demonstrations happened here in the commercial capital, Dar es Salaam, and they spread in other parts of the country. And in the attempt to quell that protest, to quell that uprising, state authorities used excessive forces, which unfortunately President Samia came forward to defend it, the way the state apparatus, state security agencies
for a moment.
reacted. Because
Khalifa, if you can hear me,
she said these people are going to overthrow the government.
Yes. So, Khalifa, my apologies because of time. You know, we followed that story very, very passionately, what has played out in Tanzania. In fact, the people were making a joke around it that it is clear that what a man can do, a woman can do better with the Tanzanian case. But let me bring in Bonolo. Bonolo, besides responding to the question of a young continent obsessed with old men, there's something now being a big conversation that has to do with what people are calling civilian coups. You know, the recent coups that had happened, and one of it, the most embarrassing, had to do with Guinea-Bissau, where for the first time we saw a president on the verge of losing an election was the one that announced the coup before the military even came on board, and it was the one granting pressure. So you can see that there are leaders that are, if there is a way possible, they will perpetuate themselves in leadership as long as possible, tweaking the constitution. That is a big devil we are dealing with right now. How do we navigate that part? Yeah, Bololo?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think one of the things we need to think critically about is not wait for, coups to happen or for the military to take over. So it's three things for me. I think one, what we're seeing, this idea of young people flirting with the military, but also the military thinking that they can close the gap and respond to issues around governance deficit. It brings us to an important question that we must now ask about this idea that democracy seems to be undergoing some profound transformation. And this profound transformation that democracy seems to be undergoing, it calls us to a place where we need to start thinking about its ideals, we need to start thinking about its meaning, and we need to start thinking about its future. Because what we know for a fact is that the military, its posture, it's not for governance, it's for security. And then what they then do is that they manipulate these challenges that we're seeing around us of, bad governance. And so for us to respond to this, we need to ask a few questions. And one of them being that, how is power exercised after elections? We go through a phase where we go through elections and vote for leaders, and after elections, it's business as usual. So we need to critically think about how power is exercised after elections. How do we ensure that the governed has the power to hold the one that they've been elected to power accountable? But we also need to think about badly managed elections very critically and badly run institutions. And of course, what you mentioned, how our leaders are now creatively using methods to manipulate the constitution to extend their term limit. Because if we look at all of this, where young people across this continent are saying, this thing is not working for us. And we saw in Mali, young people going to the streets to celebrate the military takeover. We saw what happened in Madagascar, here in Southern Africa a couple of weeks ago. And of course, even what has happened in Tanzania recently. And I'm afraid that we may actually see the same thing happen in Uganda next year. And I think at this point, we really need to start critically thinking about what then happens after elections. How do we put in place, systems that ensure that the executives does not have too much power to be able to manipulate, constitutions and amend constitutions for their own benefit, but also ensuring that we put in place measures that really allows for institutions to be governed well, institutions to to function effectively, and of course for elections to be run and run well. Thank you.
So, if it's not a case of manipulation of the Constitution that we've seen over the decades, I mean, we could mention Robert Mugabe, Teodoro Obiang, we could mention Eduardo dos Santos of Angola, even recent presidents. There's also the resort to muzzling opposition, either through coercion. In Nigeria, we've seen nearly all the opposition parties, defect to the ruling party, or the use of violence, as we've seen in Tanzania. We hear that there are most of the civil society activists are moving to Kenya to seek refuge and safety. And we could mention, similar cases in other parts of the African continent. So I'm bringing this to you now, Jeff. What do you find to be the options of resort to the younger population? Jeff Mote, I'm bringing this to you now. Intellectually or, physical resort in terms of options to deal with the situation such that, good governance can be instituted, entrenched?
I think the first port of call, and we're seeing this happening, I could say, in Kenya, post the protest, is awareness and education. And that's the first wave in terms of fighting what could be voter apathy, because very many of them at some point were thinking that even if I cast my vote, it doesn't matter, because it's the same people who come into office. And for the 5 years that we'll have them in the administration, it's the same issues I'll have. I won't be able to get a job. I won't be able to start my business, and all of these particular issues that I'm grappling with as a young person. But what we've seen as they've moved forward is that they're now taking control of this. There's a lot of voter education that's going on. We're currently having mass registration of voters. And these youth are the ones on the front lines urging their counterparts to come out and get their votes, telling them why it's important, and telling them that the vote is really your voice. And on top of that, they're also calling, like I said, their parliamentarians to account, because with the Kenyan political system, really nothing will be passed until Parliament puts its stamp on it. So yes, we might call, the president the bogeyman and that he's done all of these things, but there's not a single thing that happens in the country without Parliament's nod. So when you break it down further, in terms of, the Constitution and how power has been, devolved in some aspects, Parliament really is the organ, the institution that has all of this power. And the youth have realized that, and they're now deciding that, we won't go for this executive that seems so monolithic and really hard to touch. We'll go to that person who actually comes to my doorstep to ask for my vote to go and represent me in this August House. And now having them come to town hall meetings, understanding them further and telling them, these are what we need you to do when you get back there. And for those who still seems like there's a disconnect, they're getting their own choices and they're starting early. And what they're talking about is that, yes, the elections might be in 2027, but for this to actually have the momentum it deserves, we start now. So we're seeing these young people taking education into their own hands, taking this particular aspect of fighting what could be voter apathy, being more vigilant in how the elections are being done, being that we had a couple of elections that were done a couple of weeks past. And they were there. It wasn't only the political party agents who are at the polling stations. The youth are also there. So they're part of the political process. They're really engaged. They're aware and educating themselves. And they do know that things will not be the same if they take a different posture moving towards the election. And that's one case study that's working here. And I dare say, if it could be replicated as we move on forward, this could be one of the veins that could be used to actually bring this particular change. Because we've seen across the continent, in terms of institutions and laws, we are not short of that. But they'll always find a way to work around, form and not give us the function that we need after the process is done. And that really is what's crucial when you look at elections, not only in Africa, but the world at large.
Mr. Itodo, the Kenyan example is instructive, but is the political space open enough for the younger generation of politicians in Nigeria to resort to, intellectual engagement in order to peacefully change government?
I'm sure you know the answer to that question. The political space isn't particularly open for young people. And it's not really about the legal regime, because, as you know, there's a not too young children legislation that reduced the age for running for office. But that's one factor. The other, and the bigger issue, is the lack of internal democracy in political parties. That if parties are unable to just respect the principle of transparency and accountability, and they continue to commercialize the candidate nomination process, it serves as a huge obstacle for the emergence of young people in political office. I think the second also a factor that would need to, consider, it's the sociology of the Nigerian voters. And the big question is, do we have a society that appreciates and welcomes the leadership of young people? And it's the same thing that applies to women. And I'd say that across board, there are societies that have come to acknowledge that their liberation is really tied to the quality of leaders that emerge, and whether they are young or they are old. But I have a bias for young people, and I'm saying this with every sense of responsibility, that you have young people who possess the requisite skills necessary for addressing Africa's development and governance challenges. We need to identify those young people and give them the space. And I'm not saying that they are in countries that have vested young people with a lot of responsibilities. If you go to a country like Kenya, go to the Kenyan parliament, there are young people in parliament who are to some extent performing. If you go to Botswana, if you even come to Nigeria, there are some young parliamentarians, even in South Africa. But the bigger question is, how did these young people emerge? Did they emerge out of a competitive process? Yeah, my answer is in the affirmative in most cases. But we need to get more young people who are competent, who have the character, and who have the capacity to lead, because it makes no sense. And I've said this to a lot of young people. Don't negotiate for political space and representation from the standpoint of age. No. Africa needs leaders that are energetic, that are innovative, that can deliver the transformative governance that is required. And it begins with decolonizing our minds. And I really say that there are certain leadership models that we need to uproot, from our polity. And because these leadership models, don't bode well for Africa's governance prosperity. For instance, we have been told by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah and Mika Krabayo and our nationalists, that for us to maximize our political independence, it begins with decolonizing our minds and stop looking to the West and Europe for leadership models, because the leadership models that they forced on our throat is extractive in nature. And this is why there's a clarion call for us to go back to traditional African leadership philosophies. The South African philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because you are, that says personhood, it's not individual, it's about the community. There were mechanisms of accountability that existed and predated the pre-colonial era. We need to go back to those mechanisms of accountability and make it difficult for people who assume political power and fail to perform their own bargain in the social contract because there aren't any mechanisms of accountability. That is why today's leaders, contemporary leaders, are on rampage, capturing every institution because there is no consequence. And until we build a coalition of the willing, and I love what the youth in Zimbabwe, the youth in Kenya, in Tanzania, to a large extent in Nigeria, are doing, galvanizing and putting pressure on the system and negotiating for a new social bargain. That's how we start reclaiming our democracy from the claws of this predatory political class that seem to want power just to serve their own interests and not our collective good.
You've just opened up a vista for this conversation. So what we'll do is we'll take a quick break now, and when we return, we'll begin to wind down on this all-important conversation. Do Africans elect their leaders? Stay with us. We'll be right back. Africans elect their leaders. We have a Pan-African panel on the show this morning. It's a Friday special for the good of our continent, Africa. Samson Itodo from Nigeria, Khalifa Said Rashid from Tanzania, Bonolo Makale from South Africa, and Jeff Mote from Kenya. All right, so let's start again the round robin, and I'll go back to Bonolo. You see, there's been the conversation around we need to really embrace our own model of governance, our own traditional system that really works for us so we can decide what we want and go after it. But I want to talk about young people. Yes, Africa is a young continent, as we always say. We have a lot of energy. But how much of a strategy do we have as young Africans? You see, the current leaders, when they were young, they probably had a strategy, they had a way of doing things, so naturally they perpetrate themselves in governance. But a lot of young people these days are interested in, I'm not castigating anyone, social media. It's more content, I just want to post and all of that. We don't really speak about strategy. What kind of continent or what kind of nation, what kind of society do we want to build? So maybe we can speak to young Africans at this moment and talk about strategy so we can channel the energy right. What would you be saying to young Africans, Bonolo?
Well, I agree with you. I think if we think about the liberation leaders, they had a generational mandate, right? Particularly, I'll use the South African example. The mandate of that generation, the Madiba generation, the Biko generation, the Robert Sobukwe generation, their generational vision was to end apartheid. It was very clear. They wanted to set themselves free from the suppressive system of apartheid. And they were able to do that through organizing. But they also did not just organize internally in South Africa. They organized with other countries on the continent. If you think about the frontline countries that really supported South Africa in its, project of ending apartheid. Countries like Zambia, for an example, offered South Africa strong support. Even Nigeria, they had that Nigerians used to contribute a certain percentage of their tax towards this project of South Africa to end apartheid era. And then post-apartheid, then there are a whole lot of other stuff. Apartheid was easy. It was a clear system of injustice. So it was easy for that generation to fight that system. But post-apartheid, we're looking at things like, corruption. We look at things like service delivery and all of that. So it's a lot more complex. And I do think that, and I say this all the time, that I will always be on the side of young people. I'm not part of that demographic, but maybe in my heart, I still am part of the demographic. So I will always be on the side of young people because I do think that young people on this continent are doing something extraordinary. When we think about solidarity, in a sense of how young people on this continent have been able to come together, because most of our issues here are very related. If you think about ANSARS in Nigeria, we saw young people across the continent supporting what Nigerian young people were calling for. What we saw in Kenya last year, we saw young people across the continent supporting what young people in Kenya were calling for, using this very tool, social media, to connect them. And so I think we need to think critically. This generation may need to think critically about what solidarity means. And when I speak about solidarity, I'm not talking about something nice, pink and fluffy in the sky and some moral appeal, right? Let's think about solidarity as infrastructure. how do we as young people across this continent set up an infrastructure of solidarity where we are able to have a generational mandate? Of course, considering the fact that some of the issues that we are battling with are different. So political context is important. But we can agree that while political context is important, there are some of these issues that are interrelated. And so how do we think about solidarity, not as some moral appeal issue, but solidarity as infrastructure? And what does that look like? And I think social media provides us with an opportunity and a platform to perhaps use it as that infrastructure where we could respond to some of the challenges that Africa is facing beyond our borders, beyond class, beyond geographical location, but also beyond racial lines. And two, again, on the solidarity issue, to think about solidarity as a strategy then, to say, what is our collective agency as young Africans? And once we figure out what that collective agency is as young Africans, how do we then think through strategies that help us to respond to some of these pressing challenges that we see on the continent? And like I said, I do think that we need to give young people a bit of credit, because across this continent we have seen people really do extraordinary work. If you think about the elections in Botswana, for example, I had the privilege of going to observe those elections in Botswana. A day before elections, I gathered young people at the University of Botswana, and they filled an auditorium, and I asked all of them, how many of you are voting tomorrow? And they raised their hands. And I remember asking them specifically, why are you going to vote? And they said, because we want to unseat the current government. And they did that. They unseated the current government.
It's beautiful.
Also in South Africa, as much as we have the highest, or rather the lowest number of voter turnout among young people, what we also see was this idea where South Africans would say, enough is enough now. The African National Congress has been in power for 31 years, but what that means is that it's just, promises that had been made that have not been fulfilled. And therefore, we're going to go to the polls, and we're going to take power from the African National Congress. And where we see now is South Africa in a new form of government of national unity. But it's because while there were those that did not vote, there were those that went to vote but intentionally did not vote for the ANC, and the ANC could not have the 50+1 majority that it always had throughout our history of democratic government. So I really do think that this tool of social media that we saw working absolutely incredible in Kenya, young Africans need to think about how they use it and use it effectively as a powerful tool of solidarity and solidarity as infrastructure and strategy.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail. You talked about how to use the tools right. Perhaps we can also talk about how to build our own tools, so we're not always relying on infrastructure built elsewhere. But that's another conversation for another day. But back to another point you made about solidarity, and I'll go to Khalifa. So if we're going to build on that solidarity idea, the case in Tanzania, and I've just referenced, you and I were in Ukraine earlier this year. We saw how young Ukrainians were willing to fight for their nation's territorial integrity, lay down their lives. We saw lots of young people who were buried, at that burial site. So it showed how young people can actually contribute to governance and really take a hold of governance in that sense. So what kind of help, if we were to solidarize with Tanzania in the current situation you're in right now, what kind of solidarity would you say you need from other Africans, other young people in Africa?
Thank you very much. So, first of all, I totally agree with the previous speaker on the issue of solidarity. And they say solidarity is a verb. It's a verb. It's not just an abstract thing that exists out there, but it is a verb. And from the Tanzanian perspective, I think the kind of solidarity that Tanzanian young people need right now is, in demanding freedom from the authorities. And we see this already. Our brothers and sisters from Kenya they are behind our backs, supporting us in calling for substantial reforms in the way we are being ruled. And I just hope that that will extend beyond East Africa. Maybe it can go up to Nigeria, Ghana, even within East Africa. Maybe it can go to Uganda. But, and I think that is important because, and we speak here about strategies on how we can rewrite righting these wrongs. And, I cannot stop myself from remembering a very famous quote that is being attributed to the U.S. Civil rights activist Assata Shakur, who said that, according to her, he couldn't point out any time in history where people obtained or got their freedom by appealing to the moral conscience of the very people that are oppressing them. And in the same vein, it was actually one of the American founding father, Frederick Douglass, who said that power in its very nature does not concede anything without demand. And I think that is the approach that we should take as young people, not just in Tanzania, but across the continent, that we have to demand the things. We have to demand better from our leaders. And in doing so, I think, and our South African panelists pointed this out, we need organizing. Because without organizing, and this also, Coyote, answers your question on what kind of solidarity do we need to share amongst ourselves. I think the issue of organizing is very important, because if you don't organize, you can successfully overthrow the leadership that you think does not address your concerns, only for the vacuum to be filled by totally different people. I mean, for example, we have seen this happening in Indonesia, for
Khalifa,
example.
my apologies. I will have to butt in because of time. If you don't mind, my apologies, Khalifa. We're totally out of time. I want to make sure that Jeff and Itodo have their say, Mr. Itodo have their say in 1.5 minutes each. And my question to you guys, Mr. Jeff, Mr. Itodo, is how can the young people take over their continent as soon as possible? Mr. Itodo, we're in South Africa together, and this has been about social movements taking over continents, solidarity across border, and that was a big conversation. So how do we take over as young people and make sure we perpetuate the kind of continent we want for ourselves? Jeff, you have 1 minute. Mr. Itodo, my apologies as well, 1 minute.
In that 1 minute, it's being active citizens. We've spoken about them being very active on social media, and as Bonolo and Said have also rightly put, it's a very potent and effective tool to amplify, to mobilize, to bring together on digital platforms. What we need is that translation from what they're doing on digital platforms to actual on-ground galvanizing, where they can come around and actually be active citizens and be involved with what they're doing, because there's been that disconnect, especially in some instances where many of them are very active and very vocal online of these platforms, but don't follow through when it's time to actually engage actively on ground. So for me, in that 1 minute, we use the social media platforms to galvanize and bring people together because it amplifies excellently. Translate that to on-ground activity as active citizens. Go out there and get your votes if it's registering as voters, playing your part when it comes to town hall meetings with your leaders, being involved in party politics, forming your own parties as well. So it's taking the amplification from digital media, which they're so good at, and being active citizens on ground. I think I've done that in 60 seconds, I hope.
Yeah.
Samson, to
well
you.
done. Mr. Itodo.
Well, thanks. That's a very tall order. I'll just say three things. The first one is radical indoctrination on traditional African values. We've got to use social media, to popularize some of those traditional African values that connect us. Secondly, the point about solidarity. I must say that what is happening in Tanzania is unacceptable. And it needs to go beyond Kenya. We've got to connect with young people in other parts of Africa. If they're going to protest, if they're going to write letters to the embassies or call on different institutions to hold the Tanzanian government to account, because what happened in Tanzania is unacceptable, it's undemocratic. What happened in Guinea-Bissau is totally unacceptable. And this is the time for young Africans to amplify their voice and put pressure on the system. That is what solidarity is about. And lastly, it's good to organize. It's good to supplant, and uproot leadership. But if you don't have an alternative, a replacement, then it makes no sense. Therefore, young people need to invest in building leadership capital, because it makes no sense to have a young person that will not provide the leadership that Africa requires. It will be an effort in futility. Therefore, for young people who have competence, who have character, who have capacity, put yourself forward and take on leadership, because Africa is waiting for you.
Very productive conversation, I must say. And perhaps, the significant talking point would be that challenges are not surmountable. And this is a rallying and clarion call to young people to build leadership capacity, and of course to have a generational vision. If you consider the achievements of the generation of Mandelas and Biko, as Bonono told us about earlier on. We could go on and on. Perhaps we'll have a part 2 of this conversation. Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much for coming through. We've had Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yaga Africa, who joined us from Geneva. We've had Khalifa Said Rashid, Editor-in-Chief, the Chanzo, who joined us from Tanzania, and Bonono Makagale, Program Manager, Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, University of Pretoria, who joined us from South Africa, and not forgetting Jeff Mote, Head of Content and Production, the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute, who joined us via Zoom from Kenya. Gentlemen and lady, thank you for coming through.
Thank you for
having us. And Merry Christmas in advance.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas in advance to you all. All right, guys. So you're taking up the leadership challenge.
We're already leading in our spaces. What we do here every morning is leadership. The greatest support I'll give to any leadership is to be critical of that leadership, to do right by the books. That's why we don't hold back in criticizing them. But I must thank all our panelists. It means that Africa is united. We just need to find our own uniqueness to make it work. I'm Jeffrey. You're going to have yourself a beautiful weekend. Bye-bye.
Power is not served a la carte. Take the gauntlet. Thank you for watching. I am Bukola Koka. Have a blessed weekend.
And our problems are not insurmountable, reiterating what Bukola was going to say. I'm Kairo Kikiolu. Goodbye.